Hello, I'm Andy Mack, and welcome to Movie Shorts, where I don't just ask whether a film works, but what kind of film it's actually trying to be. Shelter, starring Jason Statham, arrives carrying a lot of built-in expectations. You see Statham's name and you assume momentum, efficiency, and a familiar rhythm of escalation. A man pushed too far, violence as punctuation, and control reasserted through force. But Shelter isn't quite that film, or at least it doesn't start there. Instead of forward motion, it opens with distance. Instead of spectacle, it leans into control. This is a story about someone who has deliberately stepped out of the world, not because he can't survive in it, but because he understands exactly what surviving costs. That isolation is disrupted by Jesse, played by Bodhi Ray Breckneck, and it's here that Shelter quietly reveals its real interest. The film becomes less about hiding and more about building, not just physical safety, but foundations of trust, routine, and responsibility. The tension between the Statham persona we expect and the slower, more grounded relationship the film develops becomes its most intriguing hook. Shelter asks whether a screen presence built on dominance can be reorientated around protection, and whether restraint can carry as much weight as force. So the question here isn't whether Shelter delivers the familiar beats, it's whether delaying them and anchoring the film in that relationship actually makes it stronger. And at first glance, Shelter offers a simple setup. A man living on the margins, keeping his head down, existing rather than participating. Because the film's opening stretch isn't shaped by incident or propulsion, it's shaped by pattern. We watch how Mason moves through his days, where he sleeps, how he eats, how carefully he limits contact. Dialogue is sparse, scenes linger, and the camera often holds back, observing rather than urging us forward. The effect isn't suspense so much as containment. That controlled rhythm shifts when he meets Jesse. What's striking here is how understated their connection is. There's no immediate bond, no sentimental shorthand. Instead, the relationship develops through proximity and necessity, shared space, repeated interactions, and a gradual sense of obligation taking shape. The film quietly reframes its stakes here. The tension isn't initially about what might come crashing in from the outside, but about whether this fragile arrangement can hold. Safety feels provisional, stability feels earned, and easily undone. Anchored by Statham, Shelter asks the audience to adjust how they're watching. It withholds release, allowing routine and responsibility to accumulate before any sense of escalation arrives. It's a deliberate recalibration, one that signals this film is playing a longer, more patient game. Jason Statham's performance as Mason is defined less by threat rather than by selection, specifically what he responds to and what he refuses to engage with. This isn't a character constantly scanning for danger. It's someone actively filtering the world. What Mason recognizes almost immediately in Jesse isn't just vulnerability, but honesty. She doesn't perform innocence or attempt to manipulate sympathy. She says what she means, even when it complicates things. And Mason responds to that directness with respect rather than dominance. That response feels instinctive rather than situational. The film suggests, quietly and without explanation, that integrity has always mattered to him. Later developments subtly reinforce that idea, reframing Mason's current isolation not as retreat, but as consequence. He isn't hiding because he failed, he's removed himself because he didn't compromise. Statham plays with this restraint. There's no speech explaining Mason's values, no flashback doing the work for us. Instead, we understand him through choices, who he listens to, who he trusts, and where he draws lines. Protection here isn't about control. It's about recognizing truth and deciding it's worth defending. It's a performance built on stillness and judgment rather than impact, and that shift gives Shelter its quiet authority long before the plot presses in. And when the world pushes back, this is the point where Shelter shifts. And when it does, the action lands harder because of how long the film has held it back. When violence finally enters the frame, it doesn't feel cathartic or showy. It feels intrusive. The routines, boundaries, and fragile stability Mason has built are disrupted not by spectacle, but by inevitability. The outside world finds him, and it doesn't arrive politely. The action is gritty and grounded. Fights are short, sharp, and messy. Space is tight, impact feels heavy, and every confrontation carries a physical cost. The film refuses to stylize violence into something triumphant. It remains functional and uncomfortable. That approach carries into the car chases as well. These aren't slick pursuits through tight city streets, but difficult, unstable runs along uneven country roads. The tension comes from the balance between the terrain and the skill of the driver. Control feels temporary. Speed alone isn't enough. Crucially, the action is never disconnected from character. Mason escalates not to prove dominance, but because the boundaries he's drawn have been crossed. Protection, not bravado, drives the violence, and that distinction keeps the escalation grounded. Because the film has invested so heavily in restraint, every burst of conflict feels like a failure of containment. Shelter isn't celebrating violence. It's showing what it costs when withdrawal finally breaks. Directed with a clear sense of restraint, Shelter is careful not to overstate itself. The filmmaking prioritizes proximity over polish, keeping us close to bodies, space, and consequences rather than spectacle. Effort matters, and the film wants us to feel that. Editing favours clarity over chaos, allowing impacts and movements of strain to register. Sound design does much of the work. Engine strain, breath catches, surfaces scrape, grounding the film in physical reality rather than orchestration. What's most effective is how the craft supports the story logic. Shelter shares DNA with the Bourne identity in the way Mason is pursued, not by theatrical villains, but by trained professionals with no motive beyond doing the job. The pressure feels procedural rather than personal, which makes it colder and more relentless. There's also an echo of Casino Royale in how violence is framed as consequence rather than spectacle. Action costs time, energy, and control. Bodies tire, mistakes hurt. Once the system is in motion, it doesn't need emotion to keep going. If there's a limitation, it's that this disciplined approach occasionally risks sameness, but that feels like a trade-off made in service of coherence rather than spectacle. Overall, Shelter doesn't offer major surprises, but the ride is consistently enjoyable. The beats are familiar, the trajectory easy to read, yet the film remains engaging because it commits to tone, character, and restraint. My main gripe is a familiar one. Once again, we're asked to buy into a backstabbing or compromised agency storyline, MI6, CIA, or something adjacent. It's a narrative we've been handed many times before, and it's starting to feel recycled. Not because it's implausible, but because it's become narrative shorthand. That fatigue may be partly contextual. Watching Shelter alongside the second series of The Night Manager makes the repetition more noticeable. When you've seen that world explored in depth, these beats feel well worn. Still, Shelter works on its own terms. Its pleasures come from texture rather than twists, grounded action, a clear moral centre, and a performance that values control over bravado. It may not reinvent the genre, but it executes its version of it with confidence. This is a film that knows its lane, stays in it, and makes the journey worthwhile, even if the destination is clearly signposted. Shelter, familiar, gritty, but enjoyable. Thank you for listening to Movie Shorts. Thank you for tuning in regularly, but a special thank you to everyone tuning in from Germany and my fans in North Carolina in the United States of America. It genuinely means a lot knowing the podcast is traveling that far. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider recommending it to others or leaving us a comment on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Those small things really, really help. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Movie Shorts Andy Mack and on Reddit by searching Movie Shorts Podcast. Thank you for listening and goodbye.